Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Burn Your Draft, the podcast exploring the Reed College senior thesis process. I'm Ace Lackey, your podcast producer. Today, we hear from Alyssa Gorkin about the perils of data analysis and alcohol.
My name is Alyssa Gorkin. I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. I was in the psychology department, but I also minored in music and economics, so I spent some time in both of those departments. My thesis is titled, So What We Get Drunk, Social Anxiety, Drinking Motives, and Drinking Outcomes in an Emerging Adult, Gender-Diverse Community Sample. My advisor was Chris Anderson in the psych department. My thesis is partially in conversation with some research that I started with Chris the summer after my junior year, going into my senior year. I was able, through the undergraduate research program, to get funding. I got one of the Reed Summer Research Science Fellowships to work with Chris, and we collected quite a bit of data on alcohol use, potentially hazardous alcohol use, reasons for drinking, social anxiety, positive and negative affect, intolerance for uncertainty. We collected a lot of data. And the hope was to try and recruit a gender diverse sample to start looking at some measures that Chris is working on that measures gender continuously instead of categorically, meaning not check boxes, but rather like a spectrum. And in doing that, we made some good headway, but I really didn't get the numbers I was looking for gender diversity, being non-cis people, broadly speaking. And I also didn't really get a chance to analyze the majority of the data that I had. So Chris and I worked on a summer project on intolerance of uncertainty. That project was submitted. It actually just got published as of July of this year. And so when I started my thesis process, I was like, I have so much data, and I really wanted to focus on doing some oversampling of gender diverse people to look at social anxiety in conversation with some of the other variables that I had. And so I went through the thesis proposal process. I was really interested in looking at social anxiety, and we were specifically planning on doing a different type of modeling technique. I'm really interested in psychometrics and different analytic techniques that are used in the social sciences. And Chris and I were going to do something called structural equation modeling. And so I went back and I requested more money to request more gender diverse participants, and was able to get funded again through, I think those are the initiative grants. And so I did a second wave of data collection focused specifically on gender diverse people and their alcohol use, because we know that gender diverse individuals have different alcohol use patterns than their cisgender peers, kind of more broadly speaking. And I find social anxiety to be a really interesting concept. It was also well aligned with some of the work that Chris had done in the past, so she was able to advise on it really smoothly. And I got into alcohol use research because I want to go to graduate school in clinical psychology, and Chris is Reed's clinical psychologist. And I kind of joke with some of the people now that she researched alcohol, so I researched alcohol. And as I've navigated leaving Reed, it's actually something I found really interesting. It's part of my longer term research interests, where I plan to go kind of more long term, but that's how that started. I found Reed through kind of two primary search criteria. One being financial aid. I have a single mom. I was interested in schools that met demonstrated need. I was a Pell Grant recipient, all that sort of stuff, which made Reed a really excellent fit for me. The other thing that I was interested in my search for schools was small class sizes. I went to a relatively large public high school. My graduating class was half the size of Reed, for context. And I really wanted, one, to be out of state. I wasn't looking for schools in Colorado. And I wanted an environment that had small class sizes because, at the time, I wanted to go to law school, but I've known that graduate school was something that was really important to me. Yeah, big changes happened. And I felt from what I knew about Reed, that it was a good place to get prepared for a graduate education. And so that, paired with the fact that I got the best financial aid offer out of any of the schools I applied to, it was kind of a done deal. And my major took a little bit more time. I started at Reed as an econ major in a pre-law kind of space. I knew that I really wanted a career that was focused on helping people, and for a while that felt like the public policy law lens was going to be the right fit for me. And I realized halfway through my freshman year that it wasn't. I really enjoyed my econ classes. Like I went ahead to get the minor. There are a lot of professors and courses and concepts in that space that I really enjoy. It just wasn't something that I saw long term, especially as it related to law school. Like I was doing econ to get ready for law, and I decided I really didn't want to go to law school. So I was like, I don't know why I'm doing this whole econ thing. And I took some time to really reflect on like my own personal life and where I felt like different systems helped me and needed room for improvement. In high school, I founded a nonprofit that worked with unhoused college students, and really frequently mental health support came up for barriers to regaining housing, barriers to education. And that's something that, though I no longer want to explore professionally, really like informed my decision to pivot towards psychology and more specifically clinical work. So I reached out to the chair at the time, which was then Tim Hackenberg. And he was like, you have to change your major now so that you can get into Psych 101. And that's what I did. And I was a little nervous, but I didn't have to declare. And then I took Psych 101, and the lectures that Chris gave like really confirmed that clinical was the right space for me. She was on leave at the time, so I didn't take her courses until a little bit later. But I kind of got into that space and realized that I really liked it. It felt like a much better fit and really stuck there. So I didn't have a lot of time to decide. I took intro psych my first semester sophomore year. I needed to declare pretty quickly after that. But I was able to set up some time to meet with Chris, even though she was on leave, and talk about, what I was thinking with clinical, what it actually looked like. And I think what resonated really early and what has kind of set a lot of my trajectory for the rest of the time onwards was this idea that in a lot of the other disciplines I was looking at, I would have had to kind of choose between being like a provider or being a researcher or an academic. And in clinical psych, there's a whole world of researchers and professionals that work in academic medical centers, and they do both. And that was really appealing. I also fell in love with statistics in a way that like I didn't think I would. I took an applied measurement class with Greg, or actually a mini lab that I don't know if they still offer, but it was like a little crash course in like all the ways that we're measuring things wrong. It was like kind of super depressing and like, oh, we're doing all of this wrong, but really interesting of like how robust the research and like scientific method really can be in psychology, even though the history of that in the field can be a little murky. There's a lot happening now that really does ground it in research and practice. And that paired with the idea that like I could potentially get to a point in my career where I am both doing research and providing mental health services simultaneously was like signed, sealed, like that sounds great. And so that really like solidified the fact that like I wanted to go on the clinical psych like PhD track. So there's definitely a literature base in and of itself that's starting to emerge in substance use research and in the clinical literature about, generally they group sexual and gender minorities together. So it's kind of hard to parse out where we're seeing gender diversity versus like sexual orientation, and kind of the nuance and overlap of that in the community is different, like paper to paper, lab to lab, so to speak. But Chris is also in that space with like risk perception in her lab. This project is not a part of her funded work. It was something that she advised separately aside from like her grant over the summer and then again through my thesis. But that kind of comes out of a few different schools of thought. So the model that I adhere to and that Chris does, and a lot of, or I would argue the vast majority of substance use researchers looking at any kind of minoritized identity, be it gender, sexuality, race, otherwise, is a model called the minority stress model. And that basically attributes different stressors and responses to stressors on the idea of like perceived stress associated with different minoritized identities. And that's kind of where you'll see increased rates of mental health problems, more broadly speaking, in sexual and gender minorities. And that almost always includes substance misuse. So even if baseline substance use is comparable, which if it is or isn't is kind of very sample to sample, generally speaking, substance misuse specifically and substance use disorders are higher in individuals generally who live in minoritized identities. I think I had a semi-non-traditional approach because I did a second round of data collection for my thesis. I didn't do like my first round as my thesis. And so Chris and I had kind of made both an agreement and a plan that if I was going to continue to use data that I was at least familiar with that, one, I needed to do a second data collection, and two, that I needed to pick robust and ambitious analysis for my data. And so the bulk of my thesis process day-to-day beyond writing, which kind of ebbed and flowed depending on like deadlines and whatnot, was coding. I spent a lot of time dealing with analysis and learning about the analyses I was running, because Chris had kind of proposed we do something called structural equation modeling, which is well beyond like what they teach in like 141 as like an intro stats or in the psych stats course. And it built on what I had done over the summer, which is like another form of analysis called path analysis. It's less complicated and that I had like barely kind of gotten my hands around but felt okay with. And so first semester, I read a lot of math textbooks that Chris had sent me home with graciously. She sent me home with our copies of them, and I did a lot of reading about modeling, model assumptions, model constraints, and whatnot. And I did that while I was writing my introduction and my methods and measures, and while my data was being collected, because though I used online participant recruitment, which is notoriously very quick, when you're looking for specific targets in a population, it's a lot slower. So my data took several weeks to come in, if not longer. That actually, now that it's far enough away, might be like a gross miscalculation. It took a while for me to hit some of the targets I was trying to get to with gender diverse individuals, and balancing gender diverse individuals with racially diverse individuals, because it's very easy to recruit large hordes of white non-binary people, and it's more difficult to kind of keep a more balanced sample size. And so from there, once my data collection was done, I got to clean all my data and everything. Then the majority of the end of first semester, my winter break, through like spring break, maybe a little bit longer, was all analysis. That was like, if I was working on my thesis, I was trying to get my models running. I used a program called M+, that is really powerful and not user-friendly, is kind of the general consensus with it. And I had no experience with it prior. I had used Stata over the summer. It's just like kind of a nightmare to describe. M+, it like has lines and columns, and the interface is bad, and it has its own file types, and it doesn't support CSVs, and it's an incredibly powerful software simultaneously. So love-hate relationship with that. And there's two main parts to a structural equation model. There's a measurement model, which asks, at least in my context, if we're measuring constructs the same between groups. So my thesis was geared at looking at the difference between cis men, cis women, and gender diverse individuals, and respectively how that kind of plays out with social anxiety and reasons for drinking. And if I knew then what I know now, it's kind of interesting because I'm still working with that data in a slightly different capacity, but it was a lot of error messages, like truly just so many of them. And another one of M+'s pitfalls is they're not intuitive error messages at all. Like, they're not helpful. They don't tell you what's wrong. They don't tell you why it's wrong. They just tell you that something is wrong. And Chris and I went back and forth over truly hundreds, maybe thousands of emails. And I had textbook after textbook and articles she was sending me. And there were issues. So I ended up getting models running. And they just had like garbage fit, which, you know, we could have tweaked through constraints and whatnot. But at some point you then get into overfitting, which is, you know, if it actually doesn't fit, then constraining a model to fit is not good science. And during, like, right around spring break, it, like, really hit a T where I had to be like, Chris, I don't think this is going to happen. Like, I don't think we're going to get this to work. There's something that's beyond the point of debugging. And she had 6 or 7 advisees, including myself. So in another world, or like, you know, like my summer project, she sat down with the code and, like, really debugged it herself. There, like, wasn't time for us to do that. Again, if I knew then what I know now, that actually was probably for the better in hindsight, that we did just get to a point where it was like, no, like, I'm going to test these relationships in a slightly different and less robust way. And I learned, you know, to her point when I started the process of like, you need to take on something big to make up for the fact that like your survey is designed right now, or like you've already done the IRB, for example. I learned so much through that process about model assumptions, modeling, debugging code, writing code, M+, like covariance structures, data structures, like all of it. Like it was hugely important. And I think it sucked in the moment, but it's really cool now to realize and to have experienced that kind of simultaneously of like, I have learned so much and it's still not working. And that's okay and valuable. So I ran an analysis that I was more familiar with, and it worked beautifully because I knew how to run it, and it was fine. My thesis was done like on time and all that kind of stuff. And the like 2 or 3 weeks were like the fact that it wasn't running ended up being completely fine. So what I ended up doing instead was testing moderated mediation, which I had been trying to do through structural equation modeling. I instead did it through like regression with interaction factors and dropped the measurement piece. My results were pretty all over the place, which makes sense now that I've kind of started looking at my data from a different lens. But more broadly, what I found is that I wasn't able to test gender differences because I had to change my analytic strategy. But what I did find is that social anxiety and alcohol consumption don't have a straightforward relationship with one another, which is well documented in the literature that there's this interesting relationship that happens where social anxiety is a protective factor against drinking more broadly, meaning that people who are more socially anxious drink less often, generally speaking. But the important caveat is that when they do drink, they have more consequences associated with their drinking. I find that really interesting in and of itself. But what we found is that coping motives for drinking, which were my mediators, so like the middle part of my model essentially, mediated the relationship between social anxiety and both alcohol consumption and potentially hazardous alcohol use in such a way that increased social anxiety was associated with increased coping motives for drinking, and thus higher alcohol consumption in the average week of drinking, heaviest week of drinking, and higher audit scores. And the audit is the alcohol use disorders identification test. It's used to screen people who need additional screening for an alcohol use disorder. And so it didn't quite get me exactly where I thought I was going to go with my analysis, but it was a very interesting kind of glimpse into how those variables might have interacted in my model. It really wasn't very long ago, but it feels like a very long time ago now because I've continued to work with my data set. Yeah, I think a lot of it is really like stats knowledge and modeling and like analytic technique. When I think about like a year ago, what I was working on going into my senior year, project-wise and independent-wise, where it was at with statistics and what tests I was going to run, looking at like simple hypothesis testing, it was far more intensive. I had barely dipped my toes into data cleaning and working with data. So both my stats knowledge from like a theoretical perspective, but also my implementation and analytic skills are like night and day, like truly unrecognizable. I think another thing that I was in the process of getting better about before I started my thesis, but that really helped through the thesis process, or that I got much better at rather through the thesis process, is managing like a draft. I very much for a while really struggled with producing work that I knew wasn't completely finished. And whether it was code or action or writing, like a lot of my thesis work was like long periods of incomplete work, namely in the analysis. I didn't have as much trouble with sitting down and like writing more broadly, but it was, it's such a long document that I could not sit down and write all of it, and had to recognize that I wasn't going to sit down and write my entire introduction in one sitting. Or that if I was going to do that, I was going to have considerable editing to do on it the next day kind of thing. And so I think that was something that was really important. And the last thing, it took me a little bit longer than maybe it should have, but with an academic advisor or supervisor, when to be like, this isn't working. And I know you want it to work, and I'm trying to make it work, and I don't think it's going to work. And there was a while where it really felt like it was my fault, and I should have tried something I hadn't tried, but I really was at a point where, like, given the access to resources that I had and what I had tried, that I did just have to, like, it feels a little different than self-advocacy, but, like, knowing when to raise the red flag, the white flag, like, for real. Because there were a few times throughout the process where I was like, this sucks, and I want to tell Chris I don't know how to do it, and it isn't working. And I pushed through a few of those, I think rightfully so, but there did come a point where, like, it had to stop. Like, it wasn't going to work. And that doesn't, not to say it could never work, but at that point, in those conditions, etc., it was just not going to happen. And so that was a really big learning curve of like having to really sit down and be like, hey, like, I think you're also getting to this point, but in case you're not, I need you to know that I don't think this is going to happen. I felt like, relatively speaking, I had a pretty smooth thesis process compared to some of my peers, and I'm not like a super panicky person. So I know a lot of people are like, oh, I don't know why I panicked so much. I really didn't panic too much, but I think the advice I would give myself is probably permission to like walk away, maybe on like a day-to-day basis, or even like to like learn how to let go of what you think it's going to be. And I think I watched a lot of my peers go through that too, of like what you expect it to be when you started versus when you're like in the thick of it is really different. And that's okay. And at the start, I was so excited to be like, it's going to be so badass to be an undergrad who's run a structural equation model. And I was like so stoked that Chris thought I could handle it and that I could do it. And none of that was untrue. Like she did think I could do it, and I gave it a try, and it didn't happen. And that, you know, in hindsight, because I've continued working with data, had nothing to do with the code I was running. Like it just was completely unrelated. But at the time, I think I didn't know how to like let go of the idea that I had of it. And had I have done that sooner and like acknowledged that I think it's really easy to feel like it's, you know, the end of your time at Reed. And when you go into the thesis process, you've heard all of these other people that you've known throughout the years or in the department talk about their theses, and they sound so cool and so put together. And then you get to do your own and you're like, well, what if this is like the worst thing I've ever written? And it's like, it probably isn't. But two, it's also like okay if it is, I think. Like, I think that mostly because I know that's not true. Like, there's nobody I know who was like, yeah, this is the worst thing I've ever written. Like, no, bitch, go read your first year paper. You're wrong. Like, I don't know. I had a lot of friends that shared that sentiment. By the end of the thesis process, I know few people who are like, this is great. You should read it. And I don't know if that's like my sample size, but I think that's pretty ubiquitous. And so let it not be great for a little while. Like, you'll come back to it, and maybe you need to use it as a writing sample for grad school, and you look back at it and you're like, you know what, actually, this was fine, or this was great. But like in the moment, it just like walk away, take the day off if you need to take the day off. Like, one day of skipped writing does not equate to like not having your thesis done or an error message or whatever the like equivalent is. But at the end of my thesis, Chris and I decided to apply for me to do a summer project with my data to keep giving structural equation modeling a stat, and hopefully to get that running and then compare categorical gender or boxes and whatnot to our continuous measure. And so what my thesis actually, or what my thesis data maybe more accurately is kind of coming to, it looks a little bit different than how my bound thesis really ended, because I think that really served it as an excellent way for me to kind of start to explore those relationships, and that ultimately there's a little bit more there than what my thesis is actually able to get to. About halfway through the summer, we decided that structural equation modeling wasn't going to work for this data. Not because of the code, but because my data is super heterogeneous, which is why my model fit was so bad, because there likely is something in the measurement of social anxiety that's different between cis men, cis women, and gender diverse people. It's possible that drinking motives also differ, and how we're measuring those do. And so about halfway through the summer, actually after I had made the most headway on getting the structural equation modeling running, Chris and I were meeting, and I was like, I just don't know if continuing to push this, one, is the best science practice. Like, the fitting we're going to have to do is probably a little questionable. And two, there's a lot of work that's kind of looked at social anxiety, drinking motives, and alcohol broadly. Like, my thesis was not the first to do it. This gender piece, I think we need to find a different way to incorporate. And she was like, you know, I've been thinking the same thing, which validating, cool. Wish she would have said it first, but heard. And so we actually decided to pivot the project because I have a very robust data set. I've got about 640 participants. And after my second round, I'm sitting at about 20% gender diverse, which for almost any sample is way over national census rates. So I've got a very gender diverse sample. And so we decided, instead of being like, nope, this isn't going to work, to pivot to something that's called a person-centered approach with data as opposed to a variable-centered approach. So the generalized linear model, structural equation modeling, all of that kind of jazz falls in data-centered modeling, meaning that like the models are built around the data and not necessarily like a person characteristic standpoint. So we transitioned to something called latent profile analysis, which basically takes the data and makes groups of people based on different attributes within their data. So it's not qualitative work, importantly, which is like a whole other branch of this kind of work. It accounts for heterogeneity much better by definition because it's looking at different groups rather than imposing different groups on them and then seeing how it fits. And a few weeks ago, we finished the analysis doing LPA. It ran fine. I did it in M+. I'm on like okay terms with the software nowadays. And the interpretation of that I'm not completely done with. So I won't speak too much on it. But really importantly, what we do see in that is that social anxiety and drinking motives are defining different classes. So we ran motivational profiles, meaning I have 5 classes of people defined by their reasons for drinking. And what we see is that gender does significantly impact which class they're likely to be in. So gender is playing a role in motivations for drinking, as does social anxiety. And I am like so pleased to get to actually be able to likely publish something out of my thesis. Not just because of like the time I spent, but because I think during the thesis process, a lot of people, myself included, kind of get to a point where it's like, I'm doing so much with this. And if you're looking to go to grad school, it feels like it's not going to become a publication. And like that matters for most graduate programs. The other thing is like the person-centered thing, now that I think about it, feels like it really tangibly could help other people. Like thinking about a study-specific set of relationships. Okay, in this sample, social anxiety predicted this, which predicted that. Okay, great. That's how a lot of the clinical literature is. That is no shortcoming of the literature nor my thesis. But in terms of where I want to be and where I'd like my research to be, like, there's something really practical about, okay, if this person is highly motivated by coping, it's more likely that they're going to experience high rates of social anxiety and that their drinking is likely going to be associated with more consequences. And so from an intervention perspective, someone who presents to treatment who's either highly endorsing coping motives or highly endorsing social anxiety, it leaves a lot more leeway and a more clear picture of how you can intervene before alcohol use gets out of hand, is kind of how I would like has come out of my thesis to be used. But I think having a model for like ending a thesis in a place that isn't ideal or perfect and getting to keep working on it is a good thing for other people to potentially know is like an option outside of like specifically the content of my thesis, that I didn't really know what it looked like to keep working on my thesis. I thought it meant I was going to just like keep doing the exact same thing, and I've done like a really different thing now that's cool, and I learned even more like stats things and more about different types of modeling. I wish I could say that, like, I think my thesis is going to change the face of, like, social anxiety interventions, but it won't. And, I don't know, selfishly, it's going to help me. Like, I learned a lot. It almost certainly helped me get my job. It is certainly, I'm taking time before grad school, but I'm sure will certainly help me with my grad school process, application, transition, etc. One is that it goes by really fast, both read and the thesis process. Like, everyone told me that when I started at read, and I was like, okay. And people told me that with my thesis too, and they're right. The days are slow, the months are fast, or the years are fast. So enjoy it when you need to walk away, whether it's from an assignment or thesis work, step away for the rest of the day or for the weekend or whatever, and, I don't know, touch grass, talk to your friends, like, it's worth doing that. I think I learned that a little later in my time at read than I would have liked, and for me, there was a tendency both with my experience at read and my thesis to get really caught up in my goals and kind of like lose track of what was actually happening in front of me, and to really like fixate on my future and my future goals. And I'm glad I caught myself at some point and kind of pulled myself out of that, because read is, if nothing else, a really unique environment. And not taking advantage of that, I think, is a missed opportunity. And, like, that is not to say that it isn't flawed or that there aren't going to be days where, like, you really don't like the institution or your class or your thesis or whatever. But those days are important, too. And in terms of the thesis process specifically, like, it's okay to change your goals. Like, I wish I would have just been like, girl, it's okay if this thing is not like a master's thesis or a PhD. It's not going to be. You're not a master's student. It's that simple. And it never felt that simple, but now that I'm done with it, it is. And also, this, I don't know, maybe personal note, and I don't know how many people don't. I've heard kind of mixed results, but buy a copy of your thesis at the end. Or at least print one if you don't want to bound one. Give it to your mom or your dad or your siblings. I don't know. Do something with it, because it was a lot of time and a lot of effort. And no matter how you feel about it when you immediately finish it, it's worth acknowledging. I wrote a very long acknowledgement section. I am a wordy gal. I have to say, Chris, like, I truly could not have asked for a better advisor. Working with her for the last few years and through my thesis process has been, like, absolutely incredible. She was so helpful in my job search, too. She was also my academic advisor, and I really, like, attribute a lot of my success to my work with her. Cannot fathom where I would be without her support. I owe my friends from Reed, like, a huge thank you for listening to me ramble about all this shit for so many months and complain about M+, even though none of them have ever interfaced with it or know what it is. Honestly, the entire faculty, like, in some capacity, most of them have heard me complain about this or supported me. Greg really tried to, like, help me get through the R thing after, so a huge thank you to him for all of his analytic support. I don't know, like, my mom, she's pretty cool. And I think the undergraduate research committee, I don't actually know who's on there nowadays, but they've funded a lot of my work and are certainly the reason why, like, a lot of my research has been possible, and that is huge. So
Thank you, Alyssa. I will be keeping in mind to temper my expectations as I enter my senior year. Listeners, this is my last episode with you. I've had a wonderful year as your producer. Please help me in the handing of the torch over to Ivy Yume Leo, our new producer, as I prepare to explore the thesis process firsthand. If you enjoyed today's interview, I hope you'll join us again to hear from more students and alumni about what it means to burn your draft. Be sure to subscribe, check out our X, Facebook, and Instagram pages, write a review on Apple Podcasts. Burn Your Draft is a production of Reed College and the Center for Life Beyond Reed. Created jointly by students, alumni, and staff, this episode was produced and engineered by me, Reed College student Ace Lackey. Our executive producer is Seth Paskin, class of 1990, with technical advising from Joe Janica. Our project manager is Nate Martin, staff member and class of 2016. Music by Jack Salvucci, class of 2020, and podcast art by alumni Henry Gotchlich and Lillian Pham. This podcast was made possible by a gift from Seth Paskin.